I'm going to talk to you tonight, and hopefully you can see these slides, is lessons from across the pond. Just use that euphemism. And what I've done is I just tried to distill it, because I thought it would suit this sort of forum best, into 12 lessons in 12 slides of what I think, just reflecting, particularly we've been on like a 10-year journey, which I think Canada and Australia have also been on, and is reflecting on some of those. And I've been a part of this journey since 2008, not necessarily the leader of that journey. My predecessor, Paul Murphy, whose job I now have, he retired on March 31st. So a lot of what I know and do, I owe to him. But 12 lessons in 12 slides. So my first lesson I think we've learned in the UK is lesson 1, that success is possible. So this is our graph from our baseline year of 2007-8, where we really set out to change the landscape of organ donation and transplantation in the United Kingdom. And you will see back in 2007-8 that we had 13.4 donors. Now, in this talk and for the rest of the slides, I'm going to be using the nomenclature DBD donors, which means donation after brainstem death, or as you might say, donation after neurological determination of death, and DCD. And you'll see that when we're back in 2007-8, we had 809 donors. And 200 of them were DCD and 609 were NDD. And what we set out to do with our task force report was we set ourselves a goal that within 5 years would have increased by 50%. And actually, we achieved that in 2012-13. We were actually 49.7% increase, which we were very pleased that everyone was allowed us to round that up to 50%. And since the next 5 years have followed, we have now risen to 24.1 donors per million population, and that's a massive increase for us. It's still reached some of the Spanish levels, but we're very proud of what that represents. A few other lessons you can see on this slide is the fact that initially our growth, and especially those first 5 years, was predominantly donation after circulatory death. But what's really happened in the next 5 years is we've really grown our donation after brainstem death donor numbers. And I think this is a really important thing, because you probably have heard people say that won't DCD rob from your NDD pool, and I just don't think that's true. I think what we've seen is if you do donation right and you fundamentally alter the way you think about the way you approach end-of-life care on ICU by thinking donation every time, then actually both will grow. And there are some other reasons why both have grown, which I'll talk to later in the next couple of lessons. But I think this should reassure anyone that we are sort of, as a saying, it's called robbing Peter to pay Paul, which is basically taking from one and giving to the other and not really being any better off. And I don't think that's true. So that's my lesson number 1, just a very simple sort of reflection on what's happened in the UK. Lesson number 2, I'd like to say that I think we can have a real impact, and that actually it's not just about donors, it's also about transplants. And from this slide on the left-hand side, you can see marked our starting year, our baseline year, 2007-8, and where our changes put it through into 2008. And you can see in this that actually we've seen an increase in the deceased donors, as you've seen, but also we've got quite an active living donation, especially obviously kidneys program in the UK. But it had been going up and up in the years before when we started our change. And I think a lot of that was due to the fact that deceased donation was stagnant and people were looking for an alternative. But since we started to increase deceased donation, it really has plateaued our living donation rise. That arguably is a good thing. What you then want to see is, you can see in the pink that our transplant waiting list has fallen for 8 consecutive years, which is, I think, a fantastic situation. I'm just going to put everyone else on.
The conference has been muted.
Can you still hear me? I'll just go back to that.
The conference has been unmuted.
Yes, we can,
When
Dale.
the conference is muted, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, yes, Dale, we could still hear you when you muted. That's fine. Yeah.
I'm gonna do that.
Do it again.
A bit of background.
Yep.
The conference has been muted.
So, moving straight along then, I won't take us over to this other graph, which I think is just brilliant, which is the change in UK renal replacement therapies. And what you can see in this graph highlights, this is looking at what sort of renal replacement therapy is being delivered in the UK for patients with chronic renal failure. And it's comparing any form of dialysis, so peritoneal dialysis, hemodialysis, versus those whose renal replacement therapy is a transplant. And what we discovered, actually only probably in 2014, looking back retrospectively, that in 2012 we crossed over. And now the number one form of renal replacement therapy in the UK is an active transplant. And I think that's a real cause for celebration and really showing that actually all the work we're doing has had a real impact. Right, on to lesson 3. But since I'm petrified that no one can hear me...
The conference has been unmuted.
Just Sonny, just checking you can definitely hear me.
We can totally hear you. It's perfect. Yeah, I think I'd stay on mute. Yeah, keep going.
I will.
I'll send you a text in the box now and then just to let you know. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, bye.
The conference has been muted.
Sorry about that interruption. Now moving on to lesson 3. I think it's all about people. And we can't underestimate how important it is to get the right people to do this role. I've found over time that if you can gather the momentum and the enthusiasm of people, and donation's almost like once it gets into your blood, it's there to stay, and you can get people just so engaged, and I think that is what's made the difference. Now, we have a number of recommendations from our organ donation task force, and some of them, as Sonny mentioned, are things that you yourselves have done with donation physicians and your donor transplant coordinators. But what we set out to do in recommendation 4, that all parts of NHS must embrace organ donation as a usual, not an unusual event. And each trust should have an identified clinical lead and a trust donation committee to help achieve this. And then additional nurses should be embedded within the critical care areas, should be employed. And what we've got is what I call the triumvirate of donation, which actually exists in every acute hospital in the UK. And that is a clinical lead for organ donation, who is a donation physician, if you're using your parlance. That's predominantly about 90%, 95% are intensive care doctors. And they're employed by NHS Blood and Transplant on up to 4 hours a week. Most are on 4 hours a week. So it's a very different role. It's a very strategic role. It's an influencer role. It's a leadership role. It's not a doing role. They don't go to a donor. Their role is much more in the background. That costs us in £2.5 million a year because we have 240 of them, which is around 4.4 million Canadian dollars. Then we have our specialist nurses for organ donation, and these are they're predominantly intensive care or emergency department nurses, and we have them embedded within the hospitals, so within the intensive care unit. And by that we mean that they have their office right next to the intensive care. They go to the same coffee room. They will join the morbidity and mortality meetings. They know everyone. They talk to everyone. And they're on hand to take referrals and to support. And we have 250 SNODs, and that costs us, because they're full-time and do on-call, £19 million a year, which is 33 million Canadian dollars a year. So then, as I said, there's 250 specialist nurses. We have found over time that it's because we have relatively flat funding for organ donation in the UK, that as our activity has increased, there's been pressure on that concept of an embedded SNOD. So if you go to the smaller hospitals now in the UK, they do have an assigned specialist nurse for organ donation, but they will visit only maybe once a week, once a fortnight. and they will base themselves in the bigger hospitals. And that has just been the reality of as the work has gone up without increasing funding, without increasing SNOD numbers. It's been the reality of making that work. The other third member of this triumvirate, I think, is a very important one, and that's the concept of having an organ donation committee in every single acute hospital. And the chair of that committee is a non-clinician, maybe someone from the community, often a non-executive member of the board of the hospital, and their role is really to ask difficult questions of the clot and the SNOD, to challenge complacency, to challenge why we're doing something. Why is that patient not being brought up from the emergency department to intensive care? You know, what would a lay person think? They represent lay people in their attitude, but they come with political clout because they're part of a hospital hierarchy, or they know the hospital hierarchy very well. And they're often, because of their public figures, they've got concepts about promotion, often with links into the community, links into media, and can make donation a local concern. And that's the message. The donation is become a local concern. And so each of these, we've got 168 local donation teams now, all sort of focusing in on how making donation work in their hospital. Right. Lesson number 4 is that best practice is best set externally. And what I mean by that is I'm going to show you a series of best practice guidelines, standards, publications, and I want to highlight how many in the UK have come from groups outside of NHS blood and transplant, which I represent. And because of that, when we say you should do something, this is best practice, it's not NHS blood and transplant saying to the intensive care doctors and nurses, you should do this. It's actually this external body, which is usually very reputable, who's saying this. For example, our code of practice for the diagnosis and confirmation of death is by the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, which represents all the Royal College, all the specialties in the country. And it's a code of practice that has nothing to do with donation. It's a code of practice for the diagnosis and confirmation of death, full stop, regardless of whether it's got anything to do with donation. So when people say, aren't you diagnosing death this way because of donation, you go, no. We follow the Academy guide, which is what will happen in any circumstance. And that gives a lot of power and credibility to what we're doing. We have legal issues relating to what was previously called non-heart beating organ donation. So this was when in the early days of donation after circulatory death, many people, including myself, were concerned about the legal safety of what we were doing. And it was actually, this document was published by the Department of Health legal experts. So again, the legal issues wasn't published by NHS Blood and Transplant, but by the Department of Health. And there's this was an English and Welsh version, and there's a Scottish version of this, and a Northern Irish version with their own lawyers, all basically saying the same thing. We are regulated as doctors in Britain by the General Medical Council, and in their guide on end-of-life care, they very much said that it is a duty on doctors to explore donation and to follow national procedures. So there is a duty on doctors to follow to explore donation, and that's extremely powerful because the regulator, the General Medical Council, controls my license to practice. I tend to do what they say in every other aspect of my working life, and when they say this, then it gives you great support for actually exploring donation. We had a consensus meeting on donation after circulatory death. This was a joint, in the end, this was the decisions and was made by the Intensive Care Society and the British Transplantation Society. It was supported by the Department of Health and NHS Blood and Transplant, but in the end it's a code, a guide, a standard that actually comes from those groups. Similarly, they did one on emergency medicine and organ donation. We had for a while a UK Donation Ethics Committee, which actually was an independent group established by all 4 UK governments to look at ethical issues in donation. Sadly, they were closed down due to lack of funding in 2016, and we are missing them at the moment. But in their time, they wrote this document on ethical framework for controlled DCD. We have something called National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, and they give, basically they tell us the standards for different investigations and tests on all sorts of topics, every aspect of practice, and they did this for organ donation and transplantation, and it's from this that we have triggered referrals and who should talk to families and how we approach families. And when we talk about this with our clinician colleagues, again, we're not saying this is what I'm saying from NHS Blood and Transplant, but this is what the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence does. And given that most hospitals are audited to how they follow these guidelines, it's very powerful. And finally, another one from UK Donation Ethics Committee, which was their last one before they closed in 2016. So all of that is set externally from us, and that's, I think, really helpful and made a big difference in the UK. And from those guides, we then write our own sort of best practice guidance. But in that, we're not inventing anything. We are just bringing together everything that's in those other documents and making them a little bit more digestible in a more operational way of approach. I'll move to lesson 5. We have a lot of data in the UK, and we get this data from the potential donor orders. What happens in this audit is that every single death in UK hospital intensive care or emergency departments who are aged 80 years or less is reviewed by the specialist nurses for organ donation, and then they fill out a series of questions, and from that we gain a lot of information. So of those, there were 35,000 deaths which were audited, and you can sort of see on the drop down different things like, were they ever mechanically ventilated, were they neurologically tested, was death confirmed, were there any absolute medical contraindications. And each of these, although this is just a flow chart, has extra questions, and that will, like, why weren't they tested, why was the family not approached, why did the family say no to donation, and it's all sort of entered into that. And it's done on Dropbox, and the same for donation after circulatory death. Clearly the same starting number of deaths. Was the patient ever mechanically ventilated is the same, and then it breaks down. And that ends up with our number of donors. You'll see that this is slightly less than the number of donors that I quoted to you right in slide 1, which was 1,574. And that's because we have occasionally a few extra donors over the age of 80 who aren't captured by the potential donor audit. Now, the power of this is that leads us to this slide we call the funnel plot, which is actually how a funnel plot works. For those that don't know, we have the number of incidents over here and then the percentage of times it occurs. So if you are in this, what we call the bronze zone, you're between the 95th and 90, between the upper and lower 95th confidence interval. And this is probably 2 standard deviations. So whether your slides say your point hospital 17 or hospital 18 or hospital 16, there probably is statistically no difference in your behaviour, and it's just random statistical variation. But though hospital 7 and hospital 13 are very different. And we called this GOSBAR for gold, geo, silver, bronze, amber and red. So this hospital 13 and this hospital 3 are 3 standard deviations away from the mean, the average for their referrals. And this is publicly available, and this is also shared at every regional meeting, and it is highly motivating. We've even moved this forward, and now we write to, this is from my own hospital, this is a letter to the chief executive of the hospital and the medical director. Thank you for helping the UK with its ambition of becoming world-class. From 45 consented donors, Nottingham Hospital facilitated 34 actual, gives some information. But when compared with the national average, we're average for referral and we're average for specialist nurse presence when approaching families. It's quite blunt. To be non-average, you'd have to be either in the amber or red or silver or gold. So, average, we could be happy with average, but if you go to the very bottom, Your hospital, therefore, missed 17 opportunities for best practice out of 205. The best performing trust or hospital, similar to yours, missed 0. So this goes to the chief executive and the medical director twice a year. So we've really sort of upped the use of data and the way we compare hospitals. I'll move on to lesson 6. This takes it to that next step further. We've taken what we just said then, and we've been bolder and bolder over time. And I have to confess, there has been some grumbling about some of this messaging, but we've seen it be effective, and so we feel it is the right way. So, whereas in the previous first years we talked about your percentage, how was your percent referral, how was your percent of specialist nurse involvement when approaching families, we've now moved to a language of what we call missed opportunities, which is what we sort of send to the chief executive and what we're following more. And we're focusing on 2 particularly, and that is referral, and the other is specialist nurse involvement. And we've done that for 2 reasons. One is we know that referral, as we've increased the referral rate, our DCD donor numbers have gone up. And one might have thought that as we increase referral rate, that the actual ones we forget to refer or don't refer probably have so many contraindications they're not going to be suitable, and so why bother pushing for that? But that's not been the evidence we've found. As we've increased referral rate, we increase donor numbers. So even in this last few percent we're going for, aiming for 100% referral, and that is anyone who's ventilated in intensive care or emergency department where a plan's made to withdraw life-sustaining treatment, and the expectation is that this isn't just a one-way extubation for death in a few days, but implication is that death will follow, is expected to be referred. And that's actually part of that nice guidance I spoke to you about. Likewise, we have a huge push that every family conversation about donation should be held in the presence of a specialist nurse for organ donation. And we've made huge progress in this. So it's looking at the bottom here, you can see that for donation after brain death or NDD, we now use our specialist nurses for organ donation for that approach in 95% of occasions, and they're getting a consent rate of around 74%. Whereas if the doctor or nurse does it without the specialist nurse for organ donation, it's much lower. Now, given that this is only 5% of occasions now, it's becoming more and more meaningless what that figure is. But it's certainly not so meaningless in donation after circulatory death. So we've gone year on year increasing this percentage, and we're now up to last year 86% of approaches were with a specialist nurse for organ donation, and they got a consent rate of 67%. When we don't have them there, it's just a shockingly low consent rate for DCD. And I think it's because these nurses are trained in bereavement care, and also they have the time to speak with families and support families for this quite difficult conversations in donation after circulatory death. And I think that's what's making the difference. And if you look up here, this report in March, our senior management team meeting, it's basically focusing in on missed opportunities. This is the language we use now, not what percent you get, but how many misses have you had. London had 1, Midlands had 6, the Northwest had 2. The hospitals are named and potentially shamed if they've had more than 6 occasions in the year to date where they haven't used it and actions are taken. And I really bring that to you is to really show you that we have become bolder with our use of data and much more challenging with it than we were initially, which was initially very much a gentle approach, please refer. It's now much more, a letter will go to the lead for donation. You've had a missed referral, please explain. So it's actually changed a lot. Right, my lesson 7 I'd like to talk about is the fact that we've had our worst winter in record for the NHS. It was only meant to be in winter, but I'm still ventilating patients in my intensive care in our theatre recovery because we've run out of beds quite frequently, even last week, which was in May. So winter should have been gone, but it hasn't. I thought, that end-of-life care would be one of the first things that might be compromised when you're under bed pressure. The fact that because donation's taking on average 16 to 24 hours from the family approach to occur. When you're under huge bed pressure, why is it worth it? Why don't we just forget it? Let's not refer. Let's withdraw like we were planning, and let's get our bed back so for the next patient. Yet we've also had our most successful year ever, and that's because I think that we've actually changed the culture of intensive care. And this is probably to Paul Murphy, my predecessor's, his biggest success. But how I was trained, and many intensive care doctors, was that donation something to inflict upon patients and families after end-of-life care. But the fundamental change is now that the offer and exploration of donation is considered to be a fundamental component of good end-of-life care. And it's astonishing even in my own intensive care unit when we're ventilating in recovery, but not a single person says, I think we should pull the tube on this patient so we can get our bed back. No, if donation's a possibility and that's what the family wants, that's what they get, and we will support them to the end, and we will just find a way to keep everyone else safe. And this is a fundamental cultural change in intensive care, unprecedented. That we now think that end-of-life care is such a right of people to receive, and not just a niceness. My lesson number 8 is the value of smaller hospitals. So we divide our hospitals in the UK into activity levels, mainly for our ability to compare in our data, and we do run meetings with each of the different sizes. So you can see there the different numbers of how many preceding donors you have to have, and we average it over 2 years so you can actually so wide fluctuations which might occur if you're having only 3 or 4 or 5 donors a year can be ironed out. But you can sort of see that I once heard that in America, in the United States, they quoted that 80% of their donors come from 20% of their hospitals. So really only the big hospitals count. But we are much broader than that in the UK, and we rely on our smaller hospitals. And you can see that in the potential. You can see that in the actual as well, that our biggest hospitals really only contribute 50%, and we rely on the smaller ones. But we've had an 11.5% increase in number of donors last year, and that was predominantly in our donation after brainstem death. Half of that increase came from our smallest hospitals, from the level 3s and level 4s. So you can't neglect the smaller hospitals. So say that again. So half of the increase in our numbers of neurologically determined dead patients who became donors came from our smallest hospitals. So we would not have had such a successful donation year had our smaller hospitals not being on board, supportive, and resourced to carry this out. I think that's a really important lesson. The next lesson is a concept of organisation leads to better ethics and better ICU. And this is something that's very close to my own heart and my own sort of ethical understanding, and my background, and why I got into organisation was because of my interest in ethics and the diagnosis of death. So first of all, in admission policies, and this is the unexpected benefits that the good end-of-life care that includes donation can bring. And the first one was the concept that organ donation saves lives, sometimes the life of the donor. What we found was that a patient would come in with devastating brain injury into the emergency department, and traditionally, if there was no hope, often they would be extubated and death occur in the emergency department. But Alex Manara, a sort of very senior sort of intensivist and donation lead in the southwest of the UK, he and others noted, but he published on it, that some of these patients were coming to the ICU because of donation now. So in the past they would be withdrawn on and would die, but now they're coming and they would recover. And it really highlighted that we had a very poor practice with prognostication for devastating brain injury. And this corresponded to an article from the United States, from the critical care neurological group there, that we should be giving more time for prognostication and devastating brain injury. And this led us then to approach the Faculty of Intensive Care in the UK, and they have written and published a guideline saying that patients with devastating brain injury should, all things being equal, come to ICU, not for donation, but for prognostication to be safe. And this all came about because of these donor patients who seem to do better than expected. And this is good for everyone. This is just better intensive care. The same way for end-of-life care. I spoke about even with the pressure that we're not going to sacrifice that. But when I was taught the concept of best interests as a trainee and as a junior doctor, it was always very much in terms of anatomy, physiology, what will this cause physical harm. But now we very much have bought into the concept, as the law says in the UK, that best interests are broader. They include your values, wishes and beliefs. And now that's made us much more holistic as doctors. So we are better doctors because of what donation has forced us to learn. The other issue is because of our regulations about the 5 minutes standoff time and what you need to do to confirm death for donation after circulatory death, and because that was written into our Academy Code of Practice for all deaths, it actually has meant that in many hospitals we now have protocols that build that Academy guidance into things. And in my hospital, you have a little handheld device when you're confirming death, and it says, have you listened for 5 minutes? Have you done this? Have you done a corneal reflex? And you fill it all in. And it's that, the donation community, by asking the question, when can we safely confirm death so donation can allow, has meant that death diagnosis is safer for every UK patient in dying in a hospital. Given that we've had, every year or two we have a scandal of someone falsely declared dead outside of donation context, I think that's a good thing. The other thing we've learned is that very much the moral justification for organ donation is Kantian, not utilitarian. People always say, you're only doing that for the transplant recipient. That's not true at all. I think we do this because people, there's a quote here says, not everyone wants to be an organ donor. No one wants to be a bad organ donor. So that's fair enough. Some people don't want to donate organs. That's fine. But if you want to donate organs, you want to donate good organs. And there's a duty on us as intensive care doctors to support them to donate good organs, to give donor optimization. And all that comes from Kantian sort of thinking about treating them as an end in themselves, allowing them to choose, respecting their autonomy, not because we're thinking about the transplant recipient. And I think actually, especially from an intensive care perspective, the moral imperative to carry out donation, to support donation, is not utilitarian. And then just a bit of sadness about the eulogy for the UK Donation Ethics Committee. It was closed because of lack of money, and we are going to miss them because ethical challenges in organ donation transplantation haven't gone away. Right, just the final couple of slides now. So the first one is, in the increasing length of the donation process, this is a lesson not to follow. This is a lesson of our shame. So forget the little pale green line at the top for donation after brain death, and just take the middle green, which is the time from family approach to retrieval operation start. In the last sort of 5 years, it's gone from 15 hours to 21 hours. Just by offering cardiothoracic organs, we increased the process by 6.5 hours. It gets bigger and bigger every year, and we need to tackle it. We're trying to tackle it. It's not easy. I think it's even worse for donation after circulatory death. So just look at that middle blue. So 5 years ago, from time family were approached to withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment was just under 12 hours. Now it's just under 18 hours. And increasingly, the second most common reason families don't give consent to donation in BCD is because of the length of the process. And so here's my warning to you, is if you're not monitoring the length of the process, start monitoring now, and don't let it go out of control like this. This is not right for families. We are now pushing transplantation into midnight, 2 a.m. activities. And I was hearing a story today when someone was starting a liver transplant on a child at 2 in the morning in a very complicated case, because we're pushing it so far, it's not happening until late afternoon, and then the transplant has to occur in the middle of the night. And that's not right for the transplant recipients and for the families who are waiting for a DCD, because they don't go home, they stay to the very bitter end. And now if you're making them stay, you're potentially making them wait overnight into the day before you withdraw, and that's not right either. Something to think about, and something I never expected, and this is this, that your success leads to notice, which is good. Everyone thinks you're doing a great job, and that then leads to legislation change, because your politicians very much start to hear the noise, hear it's positive, and they get on board. And when they get on board, what they want to do is legislate, and what they want to do is opt out or presumed consent legislation. And this is some pictures of our Prime Minister and the opposition leaders, and we have complete cross-party support for bringing in legislation which may come in this year for England for presumed consent. And I think it's going to happen. And that's an issue that's got nothing to do with the evidence. This is our current evidence. As many of you may know, Wales in the UK has brought in a presumed consent, or called deemed consent legislation. And that's given us a unique opportunity to monitor the impact it has, comparing Welsh population with English population. We are potentially about to hit statistical significance for Wales in donation after brain death, having a 10% higher consent rate than in England, and that will be reached statistical significance. You can still see it hovering just below in the upper diagram, just below statistical significance, but it hasn't hit it yet. And in donation after circulatory death, it doesn't seem to be making a difference, and when our study ends, it won't be significant. It's showing no signs of that. So we are yet to statistically prove that opt-out makes a difference, but we will be bringing in presumed consent in the UK. The political will for it is so high, and that's caught me by surprise. I thought it was just noise. I didn't think it would go anywhere, but when they actually discussed the second reading of the bill in Parliament, every single speaker supported it, and that is completely unheard of in Parliament, that every speaker who talks about the bill supports it. So this is going to happen, and I suspect, I can't see any reason why it potentially won't happen in Canada, because it just seems to be the flavour for Australia, for Canada and the UK. And my final slide is lessons I wish I learned, wish we learned. So one is, I am in envy of your research, the way your donation research in the UK, in Canada, and the research into relationships you have with the ICU and with the transplant communities. That is the model I want to emulate and copy in the UK. We are years behind you, and you should feel really proud of what you built. I think it's absolutely stunning, and a credit to many people, Sonny, who, of course, is leading the call tonight. Other lesson to think about, I wish we'd learned, is you need to tackle early transplant centre variation. This is a funnel plot, but it's an upside-down funnel plot where low is bad. We're looking at kidney decline rates. So offer decline rates. Up here, the higher you are, the worse, the more often you are to decline, and the lower you are, the less likely you are to decline. And this is, every dot represents a kidney transplant unit in the UK. It is a complete scattergun of acceptance and decline of organs. And these are extended criteria, but we've got a similar slide for standard criteria. We need to tackle transplant centre variation. It seems to be unacceptable for why one centre always says yes and one centre always says no. We have flat funding in the UK, so as we've increased activity, we have seen no reward for ourselves. We haven't had our budget cut like many other areas of the NHS, and we're grateful for that. But actually, every time we go up every year, we have to maintain that effort and improve with the same budget every year. And that's getting harder and harder. And finally, what should our focus be? I showed you all that great improvement, but I haven't got the more latest numbers. But if you look at this for our kidney median days waiting, if you were waiting, and I could tell you, look, I've spent the last 10 years of my life trying to improve this, and I've taken up, the 140 days off your waiting. It's now only 900 days. I don't think they'd be cheering me on. Likewise, for lung transplants, 43% chance of death. Now it's 34%. Well, that's good. That's better, but there's a long way to go. They're the 12 lessons.